Welcome! Today we are going to be working on trees again, and specifically we're going to be looking at how to vary the leaf and foliage that you use in the canopy of the trees. Real quickly, I'm going to take a look at some of the trees that I did in the earlier videos. They will be linked below. You do not have to have watched them prior, but if you want some more breakdowns on how to draw trees at a basic level, I would recommend checking them out. You'll notice in a lot of my trees, I use either hatching or little curved hatching marks. Sometimes in the pine trees and the coniferous ones, I will use more of a line pattern in order to approximate the pine needles. It's key to remember that that's really what you're doing here, is you are approximating what the texture of that tree looks like. On these trees, you can see that things are a little bit more complicated, but we basically have the same ideas. The long lines here are just a little bit more curvy, so it's a different kind of coniferous tree, less like a traditional Christmas tree, and with more open gaps that allow you to see the trunk. But on these ones, though there is some variance here in vertical lines, most of these lines are just simply tiny little hatching marks. You can even see some examples here above where they are curved or even approximating the shapes of leaves. And even on these trees, which are far more complicated and complex, you can see that most of the marks are essentially the same. They're a mix of hatching marks, long straight marks for shadow or to show individual dissections of the tree, but in general, they are the same kind of marks. Today, as a contrast to that, we are going to be working on different ways that we can differentiate those marks, try to indicate different kinds of foliage, different kinds of leaves. And so I have several samples here that are probably too light for you to really see them, and that doesn't matter. We're going to go ahead and dive in. At the beginning here, I just want to share that I am using a Pigma Micron pen here. It is a 0.25 millimeter, and this is Bristol paper. So we're going to start off with just basic leaf patterns. I've obviously labeled this here. It's not my greatest handwriting, but I think it's fine. So I am not going to start by actually making this a circle. I've got one circle and then another on top of it. That's specifically because part of what you have to illustrate when you're working on trees and the boughs and everything up above is the fact that they will overlap each other. So we need to get some shading to just experiment with these. If you want to follow along, any shape will work, but I think several overlapping shapes is a good idea. So I'm going to start here by just making a varied undulating line. And I'm going to make sure that some of the marks that I make actually go outside of that surface. This is approximating the fact that some of the leaves are going to actually pierce that silhouette in a way that is tangible, that is visible. If you go outside right now and you look at trees, generally, even with a very simplified canopy, you're going to get some of this. These shapes are going to approximate a leaf that looks kind of like this. There's a lot of different ways that you could play with this, and all of them are acceptable. But this is what we're working on this one. I'm going to keep coming around this circle, just varying that slightly. Zoomed in a little bit more there. Hopefully that'll be helpful. And I'm going to continue just getting the silhouette here taken care of. Obviously, this is not the exact shape that you might get for a real tree, but I feel like that's a different lesson. Right now, we're just working on the textures we can use to show what leaves might look like. Let's assume for a moment that our light source is coming from here, just so we get some overlapping shadow. And then instead of making these marks like I have on the prior ones, like this, which would totally work, by the way, if you want to just make little hatching marks, that will totally function. Instead of that, I'm actually going to try to do marks like this, which will actually imply more in the way of leaves. Now, obviously, this is going to take a little bit more time than if we were just going to make a bunch of hatching marks. You got to be a little bit more conscious about things. And I'm not convinced that I won't put some hatching over this. But as I'm going with this, I'm trying to indicate leaves as often as I can. A drawing at its core is an approximation, a representation of the real world. And you always have to make decisions, choosing how close you want to get, how much effort is worth putting in. If you look at photorealistic art, there is a desire by some people to get things as close to real as you can approximate. I think it's mostly a waste of effort. If you are trying to make a drawing, you are instinctively and by nature making something that is different from a photograph, different from reality. Now, I am concentrating my marks over here because that is going to be in shadow, and thus you're going to see more marks. You're going to see more darkness. So I'm going to actually go in here and make those marks a little bit thicker. This would be totally acceptable if you wanted to actually go over this and hatch, crosshatch, scribble even, just to imply a little bit more darkness over there. The same thing is going to happen right here though, because this little ball of leaves is going to cast some shadow down here on this area. And I can actually come into this one and start doing the same thing. I am trying to get my marks to go kind of like this, wrapping around the object, because that's the way that I'm thinking about the three-dimensionality of these forms. This is another thing that really is going to help your trees and anything you try to apply texture to, really, is thinking about the three-dimensional form. If you were to reduce this to a sphere, I'm not thinking about it like this, where we're looking at it dead on. I'm looking at it and thinking about it like this. That gives me a little bit more to play with, and even if it's not perfectly accurate, it's going to be more fun. So I'm just going to keep coming around here, adding some more texture on, and you can see these already look like they are textured. If you wanted to take a ton of time and do this, you could actually go under some of these over here and just color in and shade a little bit underneath some of those little edges. I will do the same sometimes on the edge back here, as if these leaves that are sticking out on the side are actually catching just a little bit more shadow in the way that they're oriented. That will help. In these areas on the right side, because that's where the light's hitting, I'm going to have fewer marks, but it's still important to have some. In fact, some of these will actually be casting pretty distinct shadows, so it's important to make sure you still have marks over there, though you don't need to have quite as many. The idea is basically that the light source is blending all of those together. And so you can see, even though this has only taken a couple minutes, we've got something pretty thorough here. This would be a decent way to texture your tree. So let's take a moment here. You could pause this and leave this as it is. I am going to apply a little bit of contour hatching to just give us a little bit more shadow here. This is possibly going to mess things up, so if you don't like this way, then don't worry about it. Don't apply it on your own. But I find that doing just a little bit of this might help to increase the darkness over there, so I don't have to make 10,000 tiny little leaf forms. I'm going to do the same thing here, as this shape is casting its shadow on the one below it, and then the same thing here. I'm making sure that my marks are going around the contour of the objects. That will just make it feel a little bit more realistic. It's totally conceivable too that on the underside of this object you would actually have more shadow, because the light obviously can't hit the bottom. But how you handle that yourself is totally fine. So that's our first example. It's a decent way to represent leaves. I think it looks all right. All right, let's head over here. This next one we're going to call loops. And on this one, I'm going to kind of do the same thing I did earlier, but instead of making it, I'm actually going to make it less precise. I'm going to go around the edge here, and I'm just making marks like this, essentially. This will imply a different kind of leaf, obviously. This might be smaller leaves. It might be something like oak or maple, where there's lots of different facets to each of the leaves that you're putting on there. It might just be a different texture. Sometimes you are approximating a specific thing with strategies like this, and sometimes you're not. Sometimes you are simply trying to differentiate one tree from another, or just seeking novelty in how you're putting things down. So our exterior might look something like this. We're going to do the same light source. In fact, we're probably going to do the same light source for all of these, just with the way that they're put together. I'm going to start in the same kind of idea, going down this side, making loops that are hopefully indicating individual leaves. And we'll see kind of how this comes across. Now, just like I did with the leaves over here, where you get marks like this, I'm going to do the same thing here, because leaves tend to fall in these shelves almost, and that creates little bits of shadow underneath. So I'm going to try to approximate that same thing here. And I will probably go back over that shadowy portion on the side and make sure that it is a little bit denser. I have a tendency on these kinds of drawings to bounce back and forth. Part of the reason is that I don't want to smudge things. I want to let things dry. This ink dries fairly quickly, but not instantaneously. And the other is that I need to pull my hand away every once in a while to see what I've done. Even when I'm working on things like this, where I've done some practice ahead of time, probably some research, probably have some samples that are sitting off to the side, it's still not 100% trustworthy. Like, I don't know if everything's going to turn out perfectly. Ink is a really rewarding medium, but part of the reason that it's so rewarding is that it's a little bit unpredictable. I find a lot of joy in that, but it does mean that every once in a while you have to take things a little bit slow and you've got to move to the side and check out how things are functioning. This is looking pretty all right. I'm going to go ahead and start working on the little portion here. I thought for a moment about making the marks smaller here, but that actually wouldn't make sense because just because this is a smaller chunk of the tree doesn't mean it's going to have smaller leaves. Sometimes these kind of random thoughts come out while I'm recording, and, you know, sometimes things work all right, sometimes they don't. What do you enjoy when it comes to drawing trees? Why is it that you want to draw trees? I'd love to hear about that in the comments below. I'm kind of focused on what I'm drawing here, but for me, the drawing of trees is probably something that goes back to spending time in forests when I was a little kid. I grew up in Northern California for a time as my dad was in the Air Force, and there were lots of oak forests there, and I got to explore them. And my mom and dad's families are both from Ohio, and so I got to spend a lot of time there traipsing around in forests as a kid too when I went there in the summers. There's also this tie-in to Lord of the Rings and the Ents and Tolkien's love of trees. I don't know. I am thoroughly fascinated with trees, and so I find them to be a very difficult but very rewarding subject to spend time with. But I would love to hear from you as well. What is it that's drawing you here today to draw some trees? Why do you like them? Or why are they difficult enough that you are here with me today? Well, this one's looking pretty all right. It's a very different texture than the other one. The nice part about this is it's much, much easier to gradually build up those shadows. And so you get some really lovely shadow shapes. You might notice too that there is a little highlight here. That is something I've left intentionally. It creates a distinction between these two objects. Sometimes that will happen in reality, not always, but I find that it's often worth leaving. If I didn't like it, it's very easy to cover up, but if I found that I needed some distinction there later, it's very difficult to add back in without taking white acrylic or something like that. So this gives us just another example there. Let's move over to hatchings, which I talked about and showed in the earlier versions. I'm going to try to vary it a little bit here. I might use some cross-hatching. Haven't quite decided yet. We're going to start with the same kind of thing going around the edge, though. Instead of creating that nice, consistent edge like I did in a lot of the prior drawings, I'm actually going to use my hatching to create the edge of that sphere. This will create a different texture by its very nature, as all of these will. And you might be noticing that the first big thing here is just making sure that you don't just go, this is a tree, here's the exterior. You know, obviously you can do that if you're far enough away, but even if you were doing something like this, it's probably still going to be better to vary it a little bit. This is something that's tough for me to remember because when I'm in the planning stage, I just like to get all my shapes in the right places and get them where I want them to be. So if you're like me in that regard, I would recommend trying to think a little bit ahead and making sure you get that the way you want. Now, often you're going to get less of this kind of colorful, extreme hatching on the underside of the objects because that's just not really how leaves go. Sometimes they will, but I like to vary it a little bit. I'm actually going to change up the shape here so I don't get bored with us doing the same shape over and over and over again. Okay, so this is kind of my basic. Now this one's going to be pretty straightforward, just like you might think, but I am going to do the same kind of shelf thing like I've been doing on the others. This will give us a good approximation of the leaves laying on top of one another and creating these different shelved kind of appearances. If you go really strict like I am right now, it will create a very distinct aesthetic. And I'm going to go ahead and do that just because it'll differentiate this a little bit. If you didn't want to have that, you could really easily vary them a little bit. Maybe make some really dark shadows underneath each of those. But sometimes trees look this way. This is going to be kind of a fun way to do this. A little bit more interesting than some of the others that I've done prior. However, here on the bottom, I am going to just use a lot of hatching to get that nice and dark. And I might take some cross-hatching over at the end just because it will allow you guys, all of you, to see whether you like that more or you like that less. See, smudged there a little bit because I didn't work back over myself quite the right way. All right, so let's come back in here. These marks I'm making closer to one another to try to indicate the shadows underneath these marks. You could just scribble with it, but actually scribbling will be our fourth strategy here, so I'll save that a little bit for later. But you can see that's already coming together, already starting to look pretty distinct from the other strategies we've got here. Again, on the lighter sides, you still need to make sure that you have some indications of that texture, because it would be very awkward for it to just not be there in particular areas. Down here, I am going to just darken this in a little bit, because this obviously is going to create a lot of shadow. And I am going to put a little bit of cross-hatching in, kind of coming around the contour of the object, just like I mentioned over there. Switching here as it curves around the object. Okay, and I think we can go ahead and start moving into this little guy. Now maybe the shape of the shelves here is going to be a little bit different because this is a smaller bow. And let's just see what happens. This is kind of a fun way to do it. All right, we're going to come in here and make some of our cast shadow along this side from the upper portion. I'm trying to shade this in such a way where it feels like we're getting the individual shadows of those leaves. Though this honestly feels almost more like a conifer in the way that we're shading it, right? This looks a little bit more like a pine tree, though just not in the conventional shape like this, or like the others that I did that kind of vary out like this. This looks like it could be a good strategy for doing a conifer. Maybe like a juniper, which can take a lot of different shapes. Do any of you have a favorite tree? Is that a silly thing? I heard someone talk not terribly long ago about how it's a childish thing to have like a favorite animal or something. I think that's pretty dumb, honestly. Life is short, and having favorite things, favorite foods, favorite animals, favorite movies, that just feels like imbibing in the joy of existence a little bit. My favorite tree is an oak, because acorns are awesome. And that's about as complicated as that needs to be. Cool. So this is a third kind of hatching technique, but pretty different from some of the others that I've showed in prior videos. And let's move on to our fourth and final strategy for today, which is going to very simply just be scribbles. So on this one, we are quite literally just going to scribble this in. This is going to create a very different texture. It might be something that you don't like. It might be something that you like a lot. And there are probably trees where it's going to work really well and others where it's not. I'm going to once again start the texture of the exterior to just give myself something that's a little bit more interesting than just the edge of a sphere. I'm also going to vary the shape here a little bit just because, again, it keeps me from being bored. So this is going to be just a bunch of random marks, and we'll see how that kind of builds out our tree. I'm going to start this obviously the same way that I did with the others, in giving myself the shadows and cast shadows. And this is going to be one where I'm going to have to take a little bit more time here and there and stop and see how things are really working. When I talk about scribbling, I'm really just meaning haphazard marks for the most part, and then also the fact that you can come in and apply any of the other strategies over the top. This is maybe a silly way to do things, and might sound so as you're listening. and it might turn out really, really poorly. Sometimes it works really well, ironically, but the goal here is just to understand the fact that your marks indicate certain textures, certain things, and sometimes they're really important and sometimes they're not. And experimenting, trying new things, is generally going to teach you way more than dedicating yourself to a single technique or to learning about all of them before you decide to implement something. So I am varying my marks tremendously here, but I'm just building things up in the same way that I would on any of the others. Trying to get these little bits of shelf to indicate that certain chunks are overlapping others. I'm actually going to pull this one out here a little bit with some additional scribblies. And in my notes, actually, it was like scribblies, I think, or scribbles originally. I think it was scribblies, just like that one was loopies originally. But I changed that. Maybe I shouldn't have. Just going to really darken in this area over here as if we've got a much more extreme light source this time. On that train of thought, let's come over here and start scribbling this in. Sometimes I find that this is a lower stress way to draw because obviously like things are going to be messy. But the nice part about this, and this is something that is really lovely about traditional drawing and traditional painting, just traditional media in general, is when you're working like this, you get lots of marks that you obviously didn't intend because you're doing so much kind of freeform. And in that methodology, you sometimes will just create by accident these really cool, interesting things. And I find that to be such a tantalizing thing. And it makes traditional media so much fun for me. I struggle with digital media because it doesn't have that aspect. Yes, like you got an undo button and you can't smudge things in the same way you can here, but I don't know. There's something about drawing with a pen that just feels distinctly real and physical. You can see even these scribblies are coming together and we're getting something that does resemble a tree. You could imagine if you sunk a trunk onto this that it would make a lot of sense. It would be kind of this interesting tree. Reminds me of maybe a little bit of something like the Lorax. So you could pretty easily come down here and get something that gives you a trunk, which I'm not focusing on now, but it feels like, I don't know, this tree just is asking me to give it some footing. Maybe there's some rocks down under here. Maybe it's climbing up the earth a little bit. But this is just a fun and interesting tree. Scribbles are not always going to be the ideal medium for something like this, but they can be a lot of fun. And again, I think one of the most interesting things here is experimenting, trying out new things and see which ones serve your purposes for what you're working on. Well, that has been 4 different strategies for creating the leaves and foliage in your trees. I would love to hear below which one of these is your favorite and what you'd like me to touch on next. I always read the comments and I love to hear from anyone. Thank you to my patrons for helping support these things, and if you want to check out my Patreon or the Discord server, both are linked below. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon. Happy trees.